As a pre-med, I've had to take a bunch of different classes in my undergraduate years, and what I've learned is that note taking is not a good strategy in terms of optimally studying. What I mean by that is by taking notes, you're not as actively engaged in the lecture, and you're not actually going to be able to retain or study from the notes very effectively. Because what can you really do with notes? You can sort of use it as reference, right? Which is nice, but you can't study from it very well because just rereading your notes is a pretty poor study technique. What I'm going to tell you about is a significantly better study strategy that will cut your time in half that you have to spend studying, and it will probably just skyrocket your grades. I mean, for me, once I started implementing the study strategy, my GPA went up from, I'd say, about a 3.6 to a 3.8, so this worked very well for me, and I'm sure it can work well for you too. So first, I'm going to explain a little more about why taking notes isn't good. Think about the last time you were in lecture taking notes and see if anything similar happened to you, because this used to happen to me a lot. I would be trying to copy down exactly what was on the slide and sort of tuning out the words the professor was saying, and the things I was copying down from the slides, I just didn't understand what they even meant. I was just, going word for word, trying to get the whole sentence down. And when I reflected on this practice, I realized that it was kind of silly because the professor posted the slides online a lot of the time. So it was just kind of ridiculous to be copying down exactly what was already posted online. And it was also causing me to miss out on the actual content that the professor was trying to teach me. This is really bad because you're missing out on the conceptual stuff and you're not even really creating that good of a study tool. So what I decided to do instead was to focus on the conceptual stuff as much as possible during class. And then when I heard something that I knew I would need to memorize, so for example, an equation, or if you're in a chemistry class, maybe something like electronegativity values or pKa values was one thing I had to memorize during organic chemistry. But regardless, there's going to be these little tidbits that you have to memorize. And what I think you should do is, instead of creating notes and then going from that to a study tool, a more optimal way to go about it is just to immediately create the study tool. So what I used to do is during lecture, I would actually create Anki flashcards on the go. So my professor would say, here's a list of pKa values that you need to memorize or something, or just throw out a number, and I would immediately create a flashcard in Anki. And this cuts out the entire note-taking step, and instead, at the end of lecture, I immediately have a study tool that I can use. I also realized that taking notes while you're reading the textbook is also a terrible way to actually internalize the information while you're reading the textbook. Because what happened to me, at least, is I would have a whole bunch of notes after I finished reading the textbook, and what I'd really done is I just copied parts of the textbook into my notebook without actually learning any of it or internalizing any of it. And the way to avoid this is just to make Anki flashcards for each point in the textbook you want to memorize, and then paying really close attention to the conceptual stuff, not just trying to copy it into your notebook. You can also test your knowledge very effectively by just doing the practice problems in the textbook. I think that this is super overlooked. People just do the reading and skip the questions. And that's sort of like if you were an athlete, you were a runner, for example, and you never actually ran. You stretched and you cycled and you tried other things to just increase your overall athleticism, but you never ran. That's sort of what reading the textbook and not doing any questions is like, because you're a student and you're increasing your general understanding of the subject area. But on test day, what are you going to be doing? You're going to be answering questions. So it's really important to be practicing what you're going to be doing on test day, just like if you were a runner, you would be practicing what you're doing on race day. The other really positive part about using Anki if you're studying and you're planning on going to some sort of graduate school where there's going to be a standardized test is that you'll actually retain the information past when the class ends, and maybe even past when the term ends. Because I know that for me at least, what would happen is I would finish the first quarter and then the second quarter would begin, and I would actually forget a lot of information from the first quarter. That was at least before I started using Anki, like I just said. Once I started using Anki, I actually remembered the information from the earlier part of the year, and sometimes it would actually be really helpful for new concepts, because if you've been in science classes, you know that a lot of times it builds on itself, but some areas are a little bit more subtle, and you don't really make connections to content earlier in the year if you didn't retain it and use Anki. If you have a whole bunch of notes, that's not a study tool like I just said. It can be nice while you're working through problems, and you might be able to understand in the short term how to work through those problems, but in the long term, you won't retain the information, which is bad for not only your grades in the later part of the year and later terms of that sequence, but also during the longer tests in the bigger time frames that you have to retain information. I'm currently on my journey to becoming a neurosurgeon, so if you want to follow me on that journey, feel free to subscribe. If you have any questions, take advantage of the fact that this is still a small channel and leave a question, because I will answer it. If you also want to see other things, I have some upcoming videos. I'm going to be talking about my journey to becoming a firefighter. I'm starting a firefighter academy, and I also recently got hired as an EMT. So if you have any questions about extracurriculars like those, like I said, I'll answer them in the comments. So that's all I've got for you today. I hope this was helpful.